Please pray with me. O good and merciful God, come to us this day. Speak your truth, an eternal truth, a truth beyond time and measure, a truth that holds us and gives us light in the darkness of darknesses. O God, I humbly ask that the words I speak, the thoughts and prayers of us today may reflect that life-giving light. In Jesus Christ's name, amen. The reading from today comes from Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. I will be reading from the Message translation. Now let us attend to God's wisdom for us today. Jesus responded by telling them still more stories. God's kingdom, he said, is like a king who threw a wedding banquet for his son. He sent out his servants and called in all the invited guests, and they wouldn't come. He sent out other servants, instructing them to tell the guests, "Look, everything is on the table. The prime rib is ready for carving. Come, feast." They only shrugged their shoulders and went off, one to weed his garden and another to work his shop. The rest, with nothing better to do, beat up the messengers and killed them. The king was outraged. He sent his soldiers to destroy the thugs and level their city. Then he told his servants, "We have a wedding banquet all prepared, but no guests. The ones I invited weren't up to it. Go out into the busiest intersections and invite anyone you can find to the banquet." The servants went out on the streets and rounded up everyone they had laid eyes on, the good and bad, regardless. And so the banquet was on. Every place was filled. When the king entered and looked over the scene, he spotted a man who wasn't properly dressed. He said to him, "Friend, how dare you come in here looking like that?" The man was speechless. Then the king told his servants, "Get him out of here fast. Tie him up and ship him to hell, and make sure he doesn't come back in." That is what I mean when I say many get invited, but a few make it. This ends this reading of this holy word. May it be good news to us. That's what I mean when I say many get invited, but only a few make it. How is that sentiment supposed to be good news to us? It's a challenging question, isn't it? How do we make sense of a text like this in this environment we find ourselves? You know, out of this passage and previous parables, we see that there are winners and losers amidst God's grace. One of the challenges of reading a lectionary is we have this tendency of taking things out of context. And that's a challenge because Matthew was meant to be read straight through. It was not designed to be broken up. And I want to pull back a little bit to see how this fits within a wider context of the gospel. We go back to the previous chapter. This section of the text starts with Jesus being asked what authority he has to do what he does. Now, he might as well have been sitting on the debate stage that was happening with the vice presidents because he doesn't answer the question. He tries to get around it. And one way he does it is by telling two stories, and this story. The first is about the two sons. One says he's not going to do the Father's will and ends up doing it. The other one says he isn't going to do the Father's will, and he does it. And the question is asked, which one of these does the Father's will? And the chief priests say, well, of course, it's the one who actually does the work. And then he goes on to say, well, you realize something. It's the prostitutes and the tax collectors. So it's the IRS agents and the prostitutes that are going to get into heaven before all you holy folk even get a chance. That's a challenging statement. And then we hear this parable that we heard last week about the tenants and the king and how they refuse to give their rent to the king for the service of the land. He asked the people, well, what would you expect? Well, they're going to come in and take down those people. Those three statements are speaking about what the kingdom is going to look like. Now we come into this text, which is almost has two parts. The first, the invited guest, and the uninvited guest, in some sense. The invited guests get the message, and they choose not to show up. They shrug it off. They do what they always do. The challenge here is to see that for what it is. And then the king is like bewildered and befuddled. I have this whole big banquet hall ready to go, and no one's going to show up. What do I do? Well, get anyone. So they cram the banquet hall with the local folk. In this story, we have this concept about people coming in contact with the invitation to Christ, and people coming in contact with rejecting that invitation, and the consequences of that. This concept of the rejection leading to violence is important. we find ourselves in a time of transformation in our community. We are literally not in the church because of a pandemic. We are on the eve of an election. Things are transforming before our eyes in ways that we can scarcely begin to imagine. The challenge of understanding what's coming out of this text is a challenge to understand where God's grace is in this moment. There is an interpretation of grace where it makes us believe, well, we'll all get in, we'll all be the equal. And yet, the challenge of these stories is that that reality is not always true. God's grace does not bar there from being quote-unquote winners or losers in God's judgment. In understanding these text messages, we know that grace abides when we recognize the sacrifice that created that grace. You know, the thing that is so fascinating about both the tenants and the uninvited and invited guests is that they don't realize what's being offered them. They don't realize the reality that they know, the good news. When we take seriously that argument, we have to come to realize that that is the nature of the gospel. A hope that never dies within us. To know where we are is to understand the sacrifice that went into the grace that is offered to us today. To abide in that grace is to understand the sacrifice. As I look at this challenging time in our community, to see that and to make that real is a part of the call that we all have. To understand that call and to live into that call of accepting the good news and to accept the hope that is bound within that is at the cornerstone of what it means to have a bold and evangelic faith. The hope and the prayer resides in the acknowledgement at the core of what we do and who we are, that God's love is there for us, and that gift is freely given so that we might see and live into the hope in the midst of these challenging times, not bound by the circumstances of our time or our history, but boldly proclaiming a better and more gracious future. May it be so for us. Amen, amen, amen.